Hello everyone and welcome to a new episode of Career Talks. Today we have Youssef with an experience of 6 years in asset management. How are you, Youssef?
Good, thank you for having me.
How's your day so far?
Very good.
Very good. Nice. Youssef, it would be good to introduce yourself. What do you do and how did you end up in asset management?
So I studied engineering at the University of Bath. It was a 4-year degree. I had a placement year where I worked on a construction site. I was pretty fortunate in the sense that very early on to my studies, I realized I didn't want to be an engineer. So I started the journey of looking into what I want to be pretty early into my career because I knew that I didn't want to be an engineer. So in my second year of university, I was already thinking about what could I do. I had a few friends who studied business and finance. I learned a bit through them about what the world of finance is. By my third year, I started applying to internships in financial services. I managed to get an internship in an investment bank. And then by my final year, I applied for various grad schemes and I ended up in the M&G grad scheme in London.
Nice.
Yeah. So a very long way to get to asset management, but I got there in the end.
Nice. I think what helped is having friends and talking to people, doing some research to allocate what do you want.
And that's why podcasts like this, I think, is going to be very valuable for people.
Definitely. Yeah. And then if you can break down to us, what is asset management? Because I know that you manage assets, but it's a broad term. So your firm, M&G, what does it exactly do?
Yeah. So I think before I jump into asset management, one of the terms that people will listen to a lot is buy side versus sell side. Buy side refers to asset managers, hedge funds, anybody who is buying assets.
Okay.
So M&G forms part of the buy side. So we're just a global asset manager. We have funds that are equity funds. We have funds that are fixed income funds. And we have funds that are multi-asset funds like the ones I work on. And essentially the business model is very, very simple. People or institutions give us money. We charge them a fee on an annual basis. Let's call it 2%. So if you give me £100, I'm going to take 2% of that every year, £2. And I'm going to try to grow the value of that £100 for you by putting it into a fund.
Yeah.
That's the business model. So you can see how it's a very appealing business model for the business itself.
Makes sense. And can you tell us a bit more about what do you do? So what's the name of your role in M&G Investments and what do you do in that role?
So I'm an investment analyst in the multi-asset team. What does that actually mean? So if you think about what I said earlier about M&G having a suite of funds, most asset managers break down those funds by asset class. So the equity team will be separate, the fixed income team will be separate, and then you have the multi-asset team, like my team. It's also called an asset allocation team. My job day to day, I start my day by opening a Bloomberg screen. I look at what happened in markets, and I work very, very closely with a fund manager. And the fund manager's job is to decide what to buy and sell. So as you can imagine, a big part of my portion of my job is to spend a lot of my time focusing on analyzing the assets that we can buy. For example, I'll give you to make things a bit more concrete. If prices of equities fall by 20% in a specific market, that might flag an interest to us as investors. I'll then go and have a look at why those prices have moved. Do I think that's been rational or irrational? And then have a conversation with the broader team to decide, okay, are we going to do something about this? Are we going to react? A lot of the job, at least in my team and the way we manage money, is reactive. Instead of trying to be active and trying to forecast what's going to happen in the future, we wait for markets to move.
Interesting.
And then we try to establish, do we agree or disagree with those moves?
So you spot a trend, let's say, like the market heads downwards, and then do you make a decision? If it stays downwards for a while, do we want to buy or do we just want to wait more, depending on your analysis, I'm assuming?
Yeah, I would probably shy away from that because one of the things that's shown empirically is it's very hard to time the market. So it's very hard to know when to buy and sell exactly. It's a lot easier to invest the way we do, which is more long-term.
Makes sense.
So you can make an observation around valuations and say, I think this company or this sector is cheap based on a PE multiple, for example. I think it's a PE multiple that's below average. And therefore, over the next 5 years, I think I have a very good chance of making money.
Okay.
a lot of asset managers and a lot of multi-asset managers and macro investors like my team conventionally spend their time making macro forecasts. So they spend their time trying to analyze fundamental data, for example, inflation or profits, and they try to figure out, okay, what is the next step? Okay, do we think inflation is going to go down or up? And then what do we think prices are going to do? And therefore, we should position our portfolios based on that. Does that make sense? That's a conventional way of thinking. We don't do that.
Okay.
So I don't spend my time forecasting anything. We think forecasts are very futile because most people get forecasts wrong. They might not admit it, or maybe they get a few right in a row, and that makes them feel like they get them all the time right. But over 10, 20 years of investing, it's very hard to find somebody who can forecast market or out forecast markets. So we spend a lot of our time looking at prices, looking at valuations, and then trying to assess the fundamentals to see if they're justified.
Makes
sense. So that's what makes my job very
unique. Just trying to get a sense of whether there's a value from this asset that I'm buying, and if there's a potential for this value to increase over time, then
that's correct.
I don't mind the short-term changes.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. What I wanted to know more about as well is, if you're an investment analyst, what are the key skills that you should have that will help you excel in the role?
So I'd say number one, you have to have an analytical mindset. And by that, I mean you have to be willing to read research reports that are published by investment banks, understand why they might have certain views, and try to analyze why your fund or the fund you're working on could benefit from those views or could not, or why you even disagree with those views or agree. So you have to be very, very analytical. You have to also be very good with numbers, so be good at Excel, things of that nature. You have to have a passion for economics and finance.
Makes sense.
You really, I spend most of my time reading about financial markets, what impacts rates. Them. And if I didn't enjoy that, I would find the job a lot less enjoyable. Number 3 or 2, probably communication. Because when you have an idea or when you're told to look at something, you then need to present it to somebody, to a decision maker like a fund manager. And so you need to be able to articulate exactly what you're trying to say in a very clear, concise manner. And then the final point is you need to be able to take criticism, because as an analyst, you'll often get things wrong and sometimes you get them right. And there's always a lively debate as a team, right? Some people might agree with you, some people might disagree with you. So are you able to take
it in and
to take the criticism, understand why people disagree with you? And the reality is nobody knows the future. So as much as you're convinced or you have a very high conviction about an idea, that doesn't change the fact that you might be completely wrong. And so being able to have that humility to say, look, I'm wrong, or I'm taking criticism, I think is important.
Makes sense. And you mentioned using Excel and doing some kind of like having the interest in doing analysis, even before having interest in financial markets and economics. Can you explain what do you exactly do on Excel? Do you do kind of like financial modeling, just briefly, so people can get a sense of, if I need to be an investment analyst, that's what I'm probably going to use Excel for?
Very good question. I think that goes back to my initial answer about asset classes. So if you're working in an equity fund, you will spend a lot of time building DCFs. Okay, so that let's just get that out of the way. You probably need to be very good at building a DCF and doing financial modeling. If you're working in a multi-asset team like mine, we don't do individual stock picking, right? So we don't look at individual company balance sheets. We spend a lot of time looking at macro. So things that we would try to do on Excel, for example, is look at correlations between different asset classes. So I might look at the MSCI world, or all country world, and plot that versus a government bond issued by the state, so the U.S. Treasury, right? So take a Treasury bond versus the S&P
index fund, or
and try to see the correlation, because that tells me that if I have both of those assets in my portfolio, I have an idea of how they might behave.
Makes
sense. Spend a lot of time on those things. You also spend time looking at historical phases. So I'll give you a topical example. Today we have high inflation across most of the world. We might then choose to look at the 1970s, which was a period of high inflation, to understand what the monetary policies were back then, the fiscal policies, why we had high inflation, what was done to bring down inflation. Debt levels were obviously very, very different, etc., etc. So that's the type of analysis you would do as a multi-asset investor. Obviously, if you're an equity investor, as I mentioned, you'll do more bottom-up stuff. So it'll be more on the modeling side.
Makes sense. Makes sense. That's a very insightful answer. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And if you can break down also the interview process for us. So as a graduate, you apply to this graduate scheme. And from what I see, there's different stages in different industries. Some do the screenings, the behaviorals first. Some people directly would want to do the technical stuff. So can you just tell us each stage of the interview process and how you prepared for that stage?
Okay. So for me, this was back in 2016. There were 3 stages. The first stage was a video interview with competency questions, and a video interview with a computer. There was no person on the other side. To prepare for that, quite frankly, I did a lot of research on M&G just to figure out what M&G was, what do they do, what kind of funds do they run, and I prepared some of the generic competency question answers. Give me an example of where you did X, Y, Z in a group, etc., or how would you react in this scenario. That was the first step. The second step of the process was getting invited to M&G's offices for an interview with 2 people from the business.
Yeah.
These 2 people asked me questions around my motivations in terms of career. Why did I want to join M&G? Why asset management? Obviously, why switching from engineering to asset management is a common question for somebody in my position. I was asked questions around presenting a business case for a stock, for example. So maybe a stock pitch. And how do you prepare for those interviews? Again, you read a lot of Financial Times, you read a lot of The Economist. You try to brush up on concepts, macro concepts, micro concepts. And then the final step, the third step, was then getting invited to an assessment center. In this assessment day, I would call it, the morning was interviews, one with HR, one with a sort of a senior director from the company. Again, a lot of them competency, some questions around how I thought. So, I was asked questions like, how many golf balls can you fit in a Mini Cooper? Just so they can see how you think.
Your structure.
Yeah. And then the afternoon of that day was an assessment center done in groups. So there were 12 candidates, and I believe we were put in 2 groups of 6. And then the objective there was just, I think it was I don't actually remember particularly the activity, but something around teamwork. And they wanted to see how you interacted with people that you disagreed with. How would you give criticism to people? How would you take criticism? And the way to prepare for that day, quite frankly, by the time you make it to the final stage, quite a lot about M&G.
Just revise your preparation, your behaviorals, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. And you I know it sounds cliche. People always tell you to be yourself. I think being yourself is good unless you're a very unpleasant person. So in an asset management, in the assessment center, for example, we were 12. And I particularly remember 2 people who were very sort of dominant, out there, really aggressive, really pushy, and you could tell that maybe in their scenario they shouldn't have been themselves, if that's who they are. So just being wary of how people might view you, because in an assessment center there's about 4 or 5 people in a room watching you. It's a bit like being in a zoo, right? People just looking at the person. So you just have to be aware of how you might come across. Maybe before that, a lot of us hadn't thought about that, right? Because you go to high school, then you go to university, and you don't really think about how you come across.
Definitely. Yeah, I think when it comes to one-on-one interviews, it's better to not overthink of, what is this person going to think of me? But then when it comes to teamwork, you should just make sure you're aligned with what strategies do you want to use when they tell you, answer this question collectively, or so that's definitely a key thing to keep in mind when you prepare for your assessment center or assessment day. Perfect. I think one thing that I would like to know, what do you like most about the job, and what is your least favorite part?
What I like most, by far, I don't even have to think long about this, is the fact that my job is very varied. So markets are rarely repetitive.
Yeah.
Markets are very entertaining if you follow stocks or bonds or just macroeconomics. There's always surprises. And so intellectually it's very, very stimulating. And the only reason I'm saying that is, as you do as well, you have many friends who work across industries. And this is why asset management for me is unique, is the fact that no day is really the same, because prices move. Prices also move for reasons that you don't expect them to move. So it's very psychologically very challenging and also intellectually very stimulating. What's my least favorite part? I'll answer it slightly differently. What do I think people might not like about this job?
That's also
is probably, yeah. So if you are somebody who always believes that they're always right, and who has always been right for most of their life, then you might struggle with asset management.
It's challenging
because it's a very humiliating job.
Yeah.
A lot of smart people do it. A lot of people with high IQs, a lot of people from top universities are trying to do the same thing as you. And so if you've intellectually always been at the top, you might struggle. And actually, we see this a lot in M&G. We see it across the industry, where some of the best investors are not the best students.
Makes sense.
And so if you come into it with a conventional thought of high grades and high achievement is going to translate into good investment performance, I don't think that's necessarily the case. So that's something that's worth warning people who might consider it as a career.
I think that also applies beyond asset management. It's always good to come into your first, especially if it's your first job, with mindset of I want to learn, I want to listen to people first, and then I can see what can I add to that role or the position that I'm in. And then the last question would be, if you had one advice to graduates, or you can answer the question if you have one advice to people that want to shift into asset management, what would that advice be?
So let's go to graduates first. I think my advice to graduates when they're looking to apply to jobs or find a career or find something that they think is fulfilling is just be honest with yourself and spend a lot of time thinking about, what do you think you're good at? What do you think you might enjoy? You don't want to make the mistake, and the reason I'm saying this is I'm kind of speaking from experience, because I spent time studying engineering, and if I had to go back and I was 18, I would probably spend more time trying to figure out what I wanted to do. The reason I ended up studying engineering is, quite frankly, it was a lazy choice. It was not out of knowledge, it was out of ignorance. It was only later on that I discovered that my passion is economics. So my advice would be something along those lines. Spend time figuring out and I know it's easier said than done. It's hard as an 18-year-old to know what you want to do for the rest of your life.
Makes sense.
But at least figure out what you don't want to do and make sure you don't end up in that, right?
Yeah.
And then more specifically, maybe for people who've just graduated, who are interviewing, etc., probably something worth keeping in mind is when you go to interviews, more often than not, the interview is actually led by you. Maybe you don't realize that, but if you choose to pick to talk about profits or about inflation, then the interviewee will probe you even more on that topic. So before you bring something up in an interview, make sure you're comfortable with that subject. And a lot of people who come out of interviews and say, "Oh, that was horrible. I had no idea what to answer." Subconsciously, and maybe they don't realize it in the moment, they probably led that interview that way.
The direction.
Yeah. And I have made that same mistake where I kind of underestimated my own influence on where the interview would go.
Yeah. Thank you for your answer. I think one last thing that I really like that you touched on is try to know what you're good at. And I think one thing that will help you know this, if you do an internship in university, try to do more than one and see where do I really give the most to my role and position. Whether you're a very good communicator, then maybe such a role, if you know economics and you have the background knowledge, that's a very good fit. But if you're a person that's really likes technology and likes programming and solving problems with a program or some type of code, then you'd rather shift into more of a coding or a data science role. So always try different positions and then try to know these are the skills that I enjoy while I'm developing or using in my job, and try to get a job in that field.
I would agree. And placements, internships, probably the most valuable thing you can do as a student, because I went to Bath where there's placements are super common. Probably if I had gone to another place where placements are not super common, I might have not done that internship on a construction site. I might have ended up in an engineering job that I didn't like.
Yeah.
So I second a lot of that. Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you very much for your time, and watch us